Elias walked through the town square with his head bowed, the familiar weight of silence pressing against his shoulders. In this town, silence wasn't just a lack of sound. It was a weapon. It was the sharp, collective intake of breath when a neighbor saw him coming, the quick, deliberate turning of heads to avoid eye contact, and the venomous whispers that trailed behind him like cold shadows. They called him the grandson of a coward. To the people of this gray, crumbling district, his name was synonymous with the Great Surrender. Decades ago, according to the history books, his grandfather Silas had handed over the resistance codes to the invaders, condemning the town to a life of perpetual poverty and subservience. Every cracked sidewalk, every rusted gate, and every empty storefront was blamed on Silas's supposed betrayal. He was the man who had traded the future of thousands for his own safety. Elias felt the heat of shame rising in his neck as he passed the statue of the heroes of the liberation, the men who had supposedly saved what was left after Silas's treachery. The glares of the elderly men sitting on the benches were like physical blows. They remembered the fires, they remembered the hunger, and they saw Silas's face every time they looked at Elias. The burden of a name you didn't choose is a heavy thing to carry through a world that refuses to forget or forgive. Following Silas's lonely death just a week prior, that burden had fallen squarely on Elias's shoulders. He stood now before the entrance of his grandfather's abandoned workshop, a skeletal building at the edge of the industrial sector. The wood was warped by decades of dampness, and the sign, Silas's chronometers, hung by a single, rusted chain that groaned in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of machine oil, sawdust, and stagnant time. Hundreds of clocks lined the walls, their pendulums stilled forever, creating a tomb of gears and springs. Elias began the grim task of clearing out the remains of a man he had loved despite the town's collective hatred. He felt a deep, aching sadness for Silas, who had died with no one but his grandson to mourn him, still branded as the man who sold his neighbors for a handful of silver. As he moved toward the back of the shop, his boots crunching on fragments of broken glass, he encountered the largest timepiece in the collection, a massive grandfather clock carved from dark, heavy oak. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, a silent, imposing sentinel in the far corner. Elias took a ragged cloth to wipe the thick layer of dust from the glass face. As he scrubbed, he noticed something peculiar about the internal assembly visible through the side panels. The gears behind the dial were massive, far larger than necessary for a standard clock, and they didn't seem to connect to the hands at all. It was a masterpiece of mechanical misdirection. He reached inside the housing, his fingers grazing a hidden cold iron lever tucked behind the heavy brass weights. With a resonant, metallic click that vibrated through the floorboards, the entire base of the clock shifted. It didn't just open. It unlatched from the floor itself with a heavy thud. Beneath the clock lay a thick, iron-ringed trapdoor. Heart hammering against his ribs, Elias pulled. It revealed a narrow, vertical ladder descending into a space that shouldn't have existed. He climbed down, his boots clanging against the iron rungs until he reached a floor of cold, reinforced concrete. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness to reveal a room that looked more like a military bunker than a cellar. This was the Forbidden Archive. One entire wall was covered in hundreds of photographs pinned to a corkboard, connected by intricate, chaotic webs of red string. Above the photos, a single word was painted in stark, aggressive white letters: traitors. Elias scanned the faces, local merchants, former teachers, and men he had seen in the square. He searched frantically for his grandfather's image, but Silas wasn't there. His name was nowhere on the list of the condemned. Instead, Elias's light fell upon a leather-bound ledger resting on a central desk. He opened it with trembling hands, the smell of old parchment filling his lungs. The handwriting was unmistakable, the precise, elegant script of a master clockmaker. But the words weren't about gears or springs. They described a secret mission, a desperate gamble involving double agents and high-level misdirection. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The ledger claimed the history everyone believed was a fabricated lie, and that Silas had accepted the brand of a traitor to conceal a truth that would destroy the town's very foundations. He turned the page, his eyes widening as he realized his grandfather had been the only one actually fighting for them. Elias turned the pages of the ledger, his flashlight beam trembling in the cold air of the archive. The entries were written in a complex cipher, a language of gears and ratios that only a master clockmaker's mind could navigate. As his eyes scanned the columns, the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Silas had never handed over the resistance codes to help the invaders. Instead, he had provided carefully crafted faulty data designed to lead the enemy forces into a logistical trap that saved thousands of lives. He was a double agent, working in the deepest shadows of the occupation to buy the resistance time they didn't even know they had. Every insult Elias had endured and every year Silas spent in isolation had been a calculated, painful sacrifice. The concrete walls seemed to close in as he realized the magnitude of the secret. The deeper he read, the darker the revelations became. The names listed under the traitor's wall in this hidden room weren't just random enemies, they were the architects of the current regime. The mayor, who stood on the podium annually to decry Silas's cowardice, was the primary name on the list. He was the one who had actually signed the surrender papers in exchange for a seat of power and a lifetime of luxury, while the rest of the town withered. The heroes of the liberation were actually collaborators who used Silas as a convenient scapegoat to bury their own blood-stained tracks and treacherous pasts. Elias felt a surge of nausea. The very air he breathed felt tainted by the deception. The entire foundation of his town's history was a manufactured lie, maintained by the very men who claimed to be its saviors. Among the cold, technical logs and maps, Elias found a bundle of unsent letters addressed to him and his mother. The ink was faded, but the emotion was raw and haunting. Silas wrote of the agony he felt, hearing his name cursed in the streets, and the deeper pain of seeing Elias come home with bruised knees from schoolyard fights he could never win. "To protect you and your mother," one letter read, "I must be the monster they need. If they believe I am the source of their misery, they will not look for the rot within their own ranks. Live well, Elias. One day, the gears will align, and the truth will strike the hour." The weight of Silas's love, wrapped in such profound and silent suffering, brought Elias to his knees. The rhythmic ticking of the remaining clocks in the workshop above was suddenly shattered by the heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots. The floorboards groaned under the weight of several men moving with precision. The mayor's private security had arrived. They hadn't just been watching the shop, they had been waiting for the moment someone finally found what Silas had hidden. Elias scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He grabbed the most critical files and the ledger, stuffing them into the hollowed-out casing of a small wooden mantel clock. He shoved the clock into a heavy canvas bag just as the sharp scent of accelerant wafted through the floorboards. They weren't coming to arrest him, they were coming to erase every trace of the archive. Heat bloomed overhead as orange light flickered through the cracks in the concrete ceiling. The workshop was being set ablaze. Coughing against the thick, rising smoke, Elias spotted a narrow ventilation shaft near the ceiling of the concrete room. He climbed a heavy metal shelf and squeezed his body into the cramped metallic tunnel. He crawled frantically, the roar of the fire behind him growing into a deafening, hungry growl that shook the foundations. He tumbled out into the cold night air a block away, watching as his grandfather's legacy in the workshop vanished into a pillar of black smoke. Desperate and hunted, he sought out the only person who might verify the documents, an old recluse living in the rusted remains of the old cannery. This man was a former resistance fighter who had vanished years ago, presumed dead by many. When Elias showed him the decrypted ledger under the dim light, the old man's eyes filled with a terrifying clarity. He gripped Elias's arm with strength and told him that the ledger was only half of the evidence Silas had prepared. Silas had left a final dead man's switch, a definitive piece of proof hidden within the town square's central monument, waiting for the one person brave enough to turn the key and end the lie forever. Elias gripped the worn strap of his canvas bag, the heavy weight of the mantel clock pressing against his hip like a physical fragment of history. The central square was a suffocating sea of false patriotism, draped in massive banners of gold and crimson to celebrate the anniversary of the liberation. High on the elevated wooden stage, the mayor stood behind a polished podium, his chest adorned with glittering medals that Elias now knew were stolen from the very souls of the dead. The air was thick with the acrid smell of ceremonial gunpowder and the rhythmic, hollow thumping of a marching band. A festive mask stretched over a decaying corpse of a legacy. Elias moved through the long, cooling shadows of the colonnade, his eyes fixed on the central monument, a towering obelisk of gray granite supposed to represent the town's resilience. In reality, it was a hollow tomb for the truth, waiting for a key. The mayor's eyes, sharp and predatory despite his practiced political smile, scanned the crowd and locked onto Elias with sudden, chilling recognition. The politician's expression didn't falter, but he leaned toward a small radio on his lapel, whispering a sharp, urgent command. Within seconds, 3 men in dark, tactical suits detached themselves from the perimeter, moving with lethal intent toward the boy with the bag. Elias didn't run. He sprinted with every ounce of strength he possessed. He dove through a narrow gap in the celebratory iron barricades, his boots skidding on the polished stone as he reached the base of the monument. The security guards were only steps behind him, their angry shouts lost in the triumphant swell of the brass music. Elias ignored the terror rising in his throat. His hands frantically searching the bronze plaque at the monument's base for the specific, gear-shaped indentation the old recluse had described. Just as a heavy, gloved hand clamped onto his shoulder to haul him back, Elias jammed the small brass key he had salvaged from the clockwork lock into a hidden, microscopic seam. There was a faint, mechanical click, a sound of perfect, rhythmic synchronization that would have made Silas proud. A hidden compartment behind the heavy foundation plaque hissed open with a puff of stale air. Inside sat a primitive but functional recording device connected directly to the square's massive integrated speaker system, resting alongside a weathered leather folder containing the original signed contracts of the Great Surrender. The guard tried to drag him away into the shadows, but Elias slammed his palm against the play button and held the incriminating documents high for the television cameras to capture. A piercing screech of electronic static tore through the air, silencing the band and the mayor's prepared speech in an instant. Then, a voice filled the square. The mayor's voice, younger but unmistakably arrogant. He was laughing as he negotiated the exact price of the resistance codes, his words dripping with the cold, calculating pragmatism of a man selling his neighbors for a lifetime of power. The crowd went utterly still, the silence more deafening than the music had been. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a chilling, collective realization that froze the blood of every citizen. The recording continued, detailing the cruel plan to frame Silas, the useful idiot clockmaker who would take the eternal blame for the town's ruin. The mayor's face on the stage turned the color of ash, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish as his own treachery echoed from every cold pillar and brick wall. Fury, slow and tidal, began to rise from the thousands gathered in the square. It started as a low, guttural murmur, and escalated into a terrifying roar that shook the very wooden stage the heroes stood upon. The security guards, realizing the tide of history had turned against them, slowly backed away from Elias, their paid loyalty dissolving in the face of the town's sudden, violent awakening. The mayor tried to flee through the rear exit, but the very people he had oppressed for decades surged forward, blocking his path with a wall of righteous, unyielding anger. Local police, who had long suspected the rot but lacked the evidence to act, moved in to take the mayor and his trembling cohorts into custody, protecting them from the mob only to ensure they would face a more formal, permanent brand of justice. Weeks later, the town felt fundamentally different. The air seemed lighter and cleaner. Though the physical poverty remained a challenge they would finally have to face with honesty. Elias walked through the quiet, overgrown cemetery, the heavy shadow of family shame finally lifted from his shoulders. He stopped at the modest, weed-choked plot where Silas lay in an unmarked grave. With trembling fingers, he took a Hero of the People medal, the very first one struck by the new Provisional Council, and pressed it deep into the soft earth atop the headstone. "The gears finally aligned, grandfather," he whispered into the wind. As he turned to leave, his coat fluttering, he noticed a tall, dark figure standing by a distant, ancient oak tree. The stranger watched him with an unreadable expression before vanishing into the creeping evening mist. The archive was open, but Elias realized that some secrets might still be hunting for him.